On the 12th of October 1973, the coastal freighter Blythe Star set sail on a routine voyage to King Island in the Bass Strait. She was due at her destination 2 days later. When she didn't arrive, the largest air-sea search that had ever been conducted in Australian waters began, in a desperate attempt to locate the ship and her crew. 8 days later, the search was called off. The ship presumed lost and the crew presumed dead. At that time, however, the majority of the crew were still very much alive. The Blythe Star was built in France in 1955, originally for a Norwegian company who named her Tandik. In 1960, she was sold to the Bass Strait Shipping Company, who renamed her Blythe Star and started using her for regular voyages around the Tasmanian coast. The day before the journey to King Island, the ship was loaded with a cargo of fertilizer and beer. On the morning of her departure, Captain George Cruikshank performed a final check and satisfied himself that the ship was in good condition. At around 8 p.m, Blythe Star left the Prince of Wales Bay in Hobart, on the south coast of Tasmania. To get to King Island, which is located to the northwest of Tasmania, she could be taken around the west side of Tasmania, a quick but dangerous route, or around the east coast, a safer route that took significantly longer. It was always up to the captain to decide which route to take, and he wasn't required to inform anyone but the crew of his decision. Captain Cruikshank usually based his decision on which route had the calmest weather on the day. On this occasion, he decided to travel the quicker but more dangerous west coast route. The first part of the journey passed without incident. As night fell, the crew manned the wheel in shifts and kept the vessel on course. By around 8 a.m. the following day, the ship had developed a slight list to the starboard side. The captain was notified straight away, and he sent Chief Engineer John Eagles down to check on the ship's ballast tanks and see if they had taken on water. Before Eagles could fully investigate, though, the ship lurched further, abruptly tilting to almost 90 degrees. At this point, crew members that had been asleep were thrown from their bunks. Water poured into the ship, and the crew had to make their way through the rising water and clamber out onto the port side, the only part of the ship that remained above the water. Both lifeboats were out of reach, and so the crew resorted to the inflatable life raft, a rubber boat measuring just 3.7 meters or 12 feet across. All 10 members of the crew managed to clamber aboard, and from there they watched the Blythe Star disappear into the water, leaving no trace on the surface. At first, there was a great sense of relief amongst the crew. As seaman Michael Dolman later recalled, "We just thought, that's the worst thing that can happen to us, and we beat it. We're home, no worries about it. We couldn't have been so wrong." This sense of optimism was dampened when Captain Cruikshank revealed that he had not had time to send a distress signal, nor had he been able to fetch the emergency radio before disembarking. The only people in the world who knew that the ship had sunk were on board the life raft. Captain Cruikshank soon went into a state of shock, so First Officer Ken Jones took charge and set off a flare, hoping that a nearby lighthouse would see it. There was, unfortunately, no response. This was bad news. The crew were not prepared to spend time adrift at sea. Several of them, having been asleep when the ship began to sink, were wearing only their underwear. Captain Cruikshank gave his coat to seaman Michael Dolman, who was the youngest person present at just 18 years old. Grimly, they took stock of their emergency supplies: glucose tablets, high-protein biscuits, and a small supply of canned water. It was not nearly enough for 10 people to survive for an extended period of time. At this point, they were around 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles off the Tasmanian coast, close enough to reasonably hope that they would be seen within a matter of hours. They paddled against the tide to try to remain close to the coastline, but started to drift south. Over the coming days, the weather changed constantly, dragging the raft closer and then further away from land. The men had to bail water out of the raft to keep it afloat as waves crashed against the sides. John Sloan, the second engineer, had a medical condition which affected his thyroid. He had not had time to collect his medication before Blythe Star sank. After 3 days at sea with no medication, his condition deteriorated and he passed away. He was given a funeral by his crewmates before they committed his body to the waves. Meanwhile, when the ship failed to arrive at King Island on time, authorities were alerted and considerable resources were made available for a search. This began on the 15th of October. More than a dozen aircraft were mobilized to search for the ship. Unfortunately, they had no way of knowing whether the ship had gone west or east, meaning that they were required to search a vast expanse of coastal waters. Trevor Sutton, a reporter at the time, later said that it was like looking for a needle in 2 haystacks. Another issue was that searchers did not know that the ship had sunk. As such, they were looking for a missing 13-metre or 44-foot ship, not a tiny life raft, which had no metal parts and thus was undetectable by radar. After 8 days without seeing any sign of the ship, the crew, or any debris, the search was called off with the entire crew presumed dead. Of course, 9 of the crew were still very much alive. The raft drifted over 400 kilometers or 250 miles during those 8 days at sea, before eventually coming ashore at Deep Glen Bay, a small rocky inlet on the Forestier Peninsula. As the survivors made their way onto land, they found that they could not immediately walk after spending so long cramped inside the raft. They crawled to safety and waited for their muscles to recover. There was a freshwater stream in the mountains that surrounded the bay, providing some much-needed drinking water. This stroke of good fortune, however, didn't take away from the fact that they were surrounded by cliffs and impenetrable forest in one of the most remote areas of Tasmania. One of the crew even suggested getting back in the raft to try to find a better place to land, but there was no enthusiasm for this idea. In the first 24 hours after finding land, 2 men, John Eagles and Ken Jones, died of hypothermia and exhaustion. These deaths hit the remaining crew hard. Not only had Jones been a leader for the group, but it also made them aware of how vulnerable they all were. Time was running out and they needed to find a way to safety. Seamen Michael Dolman and Malcolm McCarroll and ship's cook Alfred Simpson took it upon themselves to scale the cliffs in search of an escape route. They cut up the life raft to make ponchos and foot protection to aid them in their journey. It was not easy. The forest was so thick and the cliffs so steep that it sometimes took them hours to move just a few paces inland. As night fell, they took shelter in a hollow tree trunk, covering themselves in ferns for warmth. The next morning they found a track and followed it until they heard the sound of an approaching truck. Elated, they ran towards it and told the driver who they were. As Dolman later recalled, "I said, 'We're off the Blythe Star,' and he said, 'No, you can't be. They're all dead. They've pulled the search off.'" The 3 men managed to convince him that they were who they said they were, and he drove them to safety. Soon a helicopter was dispatched to rescue the men that had remained on the beach. None of the men had eaten in 4 days. In some cases, services had already been held to mark their passing. And yet all 7 men who were rescued from the beach and the forest went on to fully recover. Due to the complete loss of the ship, it could not be determined exactly what had caused the sinking. Nevertheless, the Australian government called for a judicial inquiry to determine why the search had been unsuccessful. This led to major changes in Australian maritime law. Every ship that enters Australian waters must now lodge travel plans before it sets off, and report its position every day. Additionally, emergency radio beacons are now carried on all life rafts, and life rafts are made of thicker material which will show up on radar. In relation to these changes, Michael Dolman said, "The 3 lives of my comrades were a hell of a high price to pay for this. but there are seafarers alive today because of the changes. They didn't lose their lives in vain.